On the 14th of April, 2026, Mark Carney became the first prime minister in Canadian history to convert a minority government into a majority without winning a general election. 174 seats, a clear runway to October 2029, no confidence votes to survive, no backroom negotiations with the NDP, no emergency concessions to the Bloc Québécois just to keep the lights on in Parliament. For the first time in 7 years, Canada has a government that can actually govern, and the man holding that power had never won a single election in his life until 14 months ago. Let that land for a second. 16 months before that majority was confirmed, the Liberal Party of Canada was a political wreck. They were trailing the Conservatives by more than 20 points in national polling. Pierre Poilievre, the sharp-tongued, Freedom Convoy-adjacent, anti-establishment conservative leader, was being described by analysts not as a candidate who might win the next election, but as a leader who would almost certainly dominate it. The Liberals weren't just losing. They were losing badly enough that serious people inside the party were having serious conversations about whether the brand itself was salvageable. And then three things happened in rapid succession that rewrote everything. The first was Justin Trudeau. On the 6th of January 2025, after months of internal pressure, caucus rebellions, and a finance minister who resigned in protest live on the internet, Trudeau asked the Governor General to prorogue Parliament. 10 days later, on January 16th, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, Davos regular, and man who had never held elected office in his life, announced he was running for the Liberal leadership. By March 9th, he had won it with over 85% of the first preference vote, carrying every single one of Canada's 343 ridings. On the 14th of March 2025, he was sworn in as Prime Minister, the first person in Canadian history to reach that office without ever having previously won an elected position of any kind. That is genuinely unusual, and I want to pause on it, because it matters for understanding everything that comes next. Carney did not come up through the political system. He was not shaped by it. He did not owe favors to riding associations or regional party bosses. He came from a world where credibility is measured in basis points and bond yields, where your reputation is your balance sheet, and where bad decisions do not get spun, they get repriced. That background gave him something that most politicians spend decades trying to manufacture, the appearance of someone who is above the game. Whether that's accurate is a different question. But in the political environment of early 2025, it was extraordinarily useful, because the second thing that happened was Donald Trump. Trump had returned to the White House in January 2025, and within weeks he had imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and begun making public statements, some joking, some not, about Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States. Now, if you are trying to design the perfect political environment for a technocratic, credentialed, calm under pressure central banker to run for prime minister, you could not do better than this. The election that Carney called for, the 28th of April, 2025, stopped being an ordinary federal election somewhere around the third week of March. It became, in the words of one Liberal strategist who later spoke to the Toronto Star, an anti-Trump coalition ballot. Voters who had been furious about Liberal housing policy, Liberal carbon taxes, Liberal immigration numbers, they were still furious. But furious about domestic policy is a very different calculation from furious about national sovereignty. And when Trump started talking about annexation, about the 51st state, about Canada's very existence as an independent country, a significant portion of the Canadian electorate made a different kind of calculation. They didn't ask, which party do I prefer? They asked, which leader can handle this? And on that question, Mark Carney, the man who had navigated the 2008 financial crisis as Bank of Canada governor, who had been parachuted into the Bank of England during Brexit, who spoke the language of global economic disruption fluently because he had lived it professionally, had a very clear answer. On the 28th of April, 2025, the Liberals won 169 seats with 43.8% of the popular vote. The Conservatives won 144 seats with 41.3%. The NDP collapsed to 7 seats. The Bloc held 22. It was a minority government, 3 seats short of the 172 needed for a majority in a 3-4-3 seat House of Commons. But it was also, given where the Liberals had been standing 16 months earlier, one of the most remarkable reversals in Canadian political history. And Pierre Poilievre, the man who had been leading by 20 points, he lost his own seat. Carleton, a riding he had held for over 2 decades, a riding he had won by enormous margins for years, flipped. He lost by 4,513 votes. He was still Conservative Party leader, still in Parliament after winning a subsequent by-election in a safe Alberta seat, but the psychological damage of that moment is hard to overstate. The leader who was supposed to end the Liberal era had to watch election night from the wrong side of a result that cost him his own riding. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because what happened between April 2025 and April 2026 is not just a story about by-elections and seat counts. It is a story about a deliberate, sustained, and historically unusual political strategy, one that Pierre Poilievre's camp has called illegitimate and that Carney's government calls entirely within the rules. And both of them are, in their own way, correct. After the minority result, Carney had a functioning government, but a fragile one. 26 government bills were introduced in his first year. Only 11 received royal assent. 5 of those were routine spending approvals. The opposition could slow everything, delay everything, filibuster everything, and they did. At one point, Conservative MPs spent hours in committee delivering soliloquies about the virtues of puppies in a deliberate attempt to stall the government's anti-hate legislation. This is what minority government looks like in practice. It is not gridlock exactly, it is governance by attrition. So Carney did something about it. Starting in late 2025, opposition MPs began crossing the floor to the Liberals. Not 1, not 2, 5. In 5 months, Conservative MP Chris d'Entremont, Conservative MP Matt Genereux, Conservative MP Michael Ma, NDP MP Laurie Eidlout, and most recently, most revealingly, Conservative MP Marilyn Gladu, who crossed the floor on April 9th, 2026, just 5 days before the by-elections. Gladu, a former chemical engineer from Sarnia, had previously opposed a ban on conversion therapy. She had suggested using the military to end Indigenous-led protests against oil pipelines. She was, by any reasonable measure, not a natural fit for the Liberal Party of Canada, but she stood in front of the cameras and said Canada needed a serious leader who can address the uncertainty that has arrived due to the unjustified American tariffs. And Mark Carney welcomed her into what she called the large Liberal tent. That phrase, the large Liberal tent, is doing an enormous amount of political work. And I want to come back to it in a moment because it contains one of the most important unresolved tensions in the Carney majority. By the morning of April 14th, 2026, 5 floor crossings had taken the Liberals from 169 seats to 171. 2 of the 3 by-election ridings, University Rosedale in Toronto, previously held by former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, and Scarborough Southwest, were expected to go Liberal easily. The third, Terrebonne in Quebec, was a knife-edge contest. The Liberals had won it in 2025 by exactly 1 vote before the Supreme Court annulled the result over a misprint on a voter's envelope. This was the rematch. By the end of the night, they had won all 3. 174 seats. Canada's first majority government since 2019. And the first majority in Canadian parliamentary history assembled through a combination of a general election, floor crossings from 2 different parties, and by-election wins a method that has no precedent. Pierre Poilievre's response came swiftly. The Carney Liberals did not win a majority government through a general election or today's by-elections, he said in a statement. Instead, it was won through backroom deals with politicians who betrayed the people who voted for them. He is not entirely wrong about the mechanics. But here is what Poilievre cannot explain. Why, if this majority is so illegitimate, does current polling show 52% of Canadians prefer Carney as Prime Minister compared to 24% who prefer Poilievre? Why are Conservative MPs crossing to the Liberals in the first place? And why, in 3 successive by-elections held after all 5 floor crossings had already happened, did voters in those ridings choose the Liberals anyway? The legitimacy question has traction in Conservative circles. It has very little traction with the Canadian public right now. But Poilievre's survival, the internal tensions inside Carney's oversized tent, the legislative agenda that now has no parliamentary obstacles, and the unfinished business of the Trump tariff war, that is where this story goes next. Mark Carney stood in front of his supporters in the early hours of April 15th and said 4 words that are worth taking seriously. It's time to get serious. Not "we won." Not "thank you, Canada." Not the usual victory night orchestration of gratitude and patriotic music. 4 words that signal something specific about how this man intends to use the power he just consolidated. So let's talk about what serious looks like. The first move came within hours of the majority being confirmed. Carney announced the suspension of the federal fuel excise tax on petrol and diesel, effective April 20th through September 7th. That's a saving of roughly 10 cents per liter on gasoline, 4 cents on diesel. It is not a transformational economic policy. It is a signal. It tells truckers, construction workers, and grocery supply chains, the people Poilievre spent 2 years courting, that this government sees them. That the large liberal tent is not just a coalition of urban progressives and floor-crossing opportunists. It is a deliberate repositioning toward the economic center executed on day 1 of majority power. Now watch the legislation. In Carney's first year as a minority government, 26 bills were introduced. Only 11 passed. That ratio changes immediately. The first target is the online harms bill legislation that conservative filibusters held hostage for months, including those now infamous parliamentary soliloquies about puppies. It passes. The housing acceleration bill, designed to cut red tape and fast-track major construction projects, moves forward. The bail reform legislation, Bill C-14, clears the chamber. The government's assault-style firearms compensation program, already facing pushback from several provinces, now has the votes to survive opposition challenges in Parliament, even if the political fight continues outside it. But here is the more consequential arena. The renegotiation of CUSMA, what Americans call USMCA, the trade agreement that governs the economic relationship between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Trump's 25% tariffs exist outside that framework. They are pressure tactics. And until now, Carney has been negotiating that pressure from a position of structural weakness. Every major retaliatory measure his government wanted to sequence had to survive a confidence vote first. That constraint is now gone. A majority government can absorb short-term economic pain in service of a longer negotiating strategy. That is a fundamentally different table to sit at. Scott Bessent, Trump's Treasury Secretary, told CNBC that Carney rose to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump message. That framing was a negotiating move designed to put Carney on the defensive, to frame Canada's trade retaliation as hostility rather than policy. With a majority locked until 2029, that framing has less leverage than it did yesterday. Then there is China. In January 2026, Carney flew to Beijing, the first Canadian prime minister to visit China since 2017. He came back with a deal that cut Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola oil from 85% down to 15%, and on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 6.1%. He announced what his government called a new strategic partnership between Canada and China. When reporters asked him about human rights in China, he said, "We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be." That is not a throwaway line. That is the operating philosophy of a central banker: pragmatic, unsentimental, built for outcomes rather than optics. It is also, for a significant portion of the liberal base, genuinely uncomfortable. And a majority government makes that discomfort easier to manage politically, even if it does not resolve it morally. Which brings us back to the large liberal tent and its limits. Marilyn Gladu is now a liberal MP. She voted with the caucus. She has committed to supporting a woman's right to choose, but she is one of 5 people who crossed from parties with fundamentally different values into a coalition assembled primarily around one external threat. What happens to that coalition when the threat eases? What happens if Trump settles? If a CUSMA renegotiation produces something Carney can call a win? If the tariff pressure reduces? If the 51st state rhetoric fades into background noise? The anti-Trump coalition that carried Carney to a minority in April 2025 and to a majority in April 2026 was built for a specific kind of emergency. Majorities built on emergencies have a shelf life. That is the first risk: complacency and internal fracture. The second risk is the opposite. Carney himself warned his own party just days before the by-elections, if we stand still during this rupture, we will surrender our future to others. A majority can make a government feel invincible. And invincible governments, in the Canadian parliamentary tradition, have a history of overreading their mandate. The online harms bill, the firearms compensation program, the China strategic partnership, each of these carries genuine political exposure. Each of them gives Poilievre diminished, yes, but still standing a real line of attack. And Pierre Poilievre will still be standing. He survived a leadership review in January with strong support from party members. But 4 of his MPs have now crossed to the government side. Current polling puts him at 24% as preferred prime minister against Carney's 52%. He has 3 years minimum to either rebuild the Conservative coalition or watch it dissolve further. That is the most important subplot running parallel to everything Carney now does, because the shape of Canadian conservatism over the next 3 years will define what kind of opposition Carney actually faces, and whether this majority ends in 2029 with a second mandate or a correction. Here is what we know tonight. Mark Carney arrived in Canadian politics 16 months ago as a man with no electoral history, a central banker's resume, and a crisis to manage. He leaves this week with something no Canadian prime minister has assembled in exactly this way before a majority government built from a minority result, 5 floor crossings, 3 by-election wins, and a political environment shaped almost entirely by a man in Washington who wasn't even on the Canadian ballot. Whether that majority holds, whether the tent stays large, whether the legislative agenda delivers what Canadians actually need, those are the questions that begin now.